The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the chandelier. It was enormous. Crystal. Probably worth more than my entire apartment. It hung from the ceiling of a ballroom that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never seen a room they couldn't make more expensive. White marble floors, gold trim, tables draped in silk, and every person in the room wearing something that cost more than a car. I was standing behind my boss, Julian, who was holding a numbered paddle in his hand. And he was about to make the biggest mistake of both our lives. My head was pounding. Not with a hangover, with memories. Memories of dying. Of being tied to a concrete block and dropped into the Hudson River with Julian, watching the bubbles rise as the water swallowed us whole. Memories of the cold, the dark, the silence. And then the silence breaking into the sound of an auctioneer's voice. Going once, going twice. My eyes snapped into focus. The stage. The podium. The auctioneer was holding up a necklace, a thin, delicate thing with a single pearl pendant. It wasn't ugly, but it wasn't worth more than a few $1,000s at most. A few thousand. Not 30 million. But Julian was raising his paddle, and I knew, that he was about to bid $30 million on that necklace just to take it away from Graham. Graham, who was sitting 3 rows ahead of us, his arm draped around Serena like she was a trophy. Graham, who had smiled at us that day on the pier, who had watched us drown with a glass of champagne in his hand. Graham, who was going to destroy us. I knew this because I'd lived it before. I'd lived it, died, and come back. And I was not going to let it happen again. 30 million, the auctioneer announced, his voice rising with excitement. We have 30 million from Mr. Julian. Stop. I didn't plan to shout. I didn't plan to do anything except maybe faint from the sheer pressure of the moment. But my body moved before my brain caught up, and suddenly I was lunging forward, grabbing Julian's arm, yanking the paddle out of his hand. And then, because I couldn't think of anything better to do, I dropped to my knees. The ballroom went silent. Not the kind of silent where people are politely waiting for something. The kind of silent where everyone is so shocked that they've forgotten how to breathe. I could feel every single eye in the room on me. The richest people in the city, staring at a woman in a rented tuxedo, kneeling on the floor like she was begging for her life. Which, technically, I was. Mr. Julian, I said, my voice shaking in a way I hoped sounded like devotion rather than pure terror. Please. Don't. It's not worth it. Julian looked down at me. If looks could kill, I would have been a puddle on the floor. His dark eyes were narrow, his jaw tight, his expression promising a slow and painful death. What, he said, his voice low and dangerous, do you think you're doing? 30 million is too much, I said, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead. You're paying 30 million for a necklace that was probably bought at a second-hand shop for $300. He's baiting you. He's watching to see if you'll lose control. And you can't lose control. You can't. He didn't say anything. He just kept staring at me, and I could practically see the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out whether I'd lost my mind or if there was something I knew that he didn't. I was banking on the second one. Please, I said, and I made my voice as desperate as I felt. I know I'm just your assistant. I know I don't have the right to speak. But if you trust me, if you listen to me just this once, I promise I can make this right. I can make us more money than you ever dreamed. Just please. I stopped, because I didn't want to say the words I was thinking. Just please don't do the thing that got us killed last time. There was a long pause. And then, somewhere behind us, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone laughing. Graham, no doubt, delighted by the spectacle his rival was making of himself. Serena's voice followed, soft and saccharine. What an interesting assistant you have, Julian. I didn't know you kept your staff on such a short leash. Julian's eyes flicked to Graham's direction, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not kindness, exactly, but calculation. He looked down at me again. Get up, he said. I got up. Follow me. And he turned and walked out of the ballroom. I followed him. I didn't look back at Graham's smug face or Serena's satisfied smile. I didn't care what they thought. I cared about getting out of this room alive. The car was black, sleek, and terrifyingly silent. Julian didn't speak to me the entire drive. He stared out the window, his fingers drumming on his knee, his jaw still tight with barely suppressed anger. I sat as far away from him as possible, trying to make myself invisible. It didn't work. When we finally reached his penthouse, a glass and steel monstrosity that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated the concept of comfort, he led me to his office and closed the door behind us. "Explain," he said. "I'm sorry, sir. I know I overstepped." "You didn't overstep. You humiliated me in front of the entire city." He walked toward me, and I instinctively backed up until I hit a bookshelf. "You made me look like a fool. You made me look weak. And the only reason you're still alive right now is that I'm curious." Curious. Curious about why my quiet, obedient assistant suddenly decided to grow a spine. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Curious about what you know that you're not telling me." I swallowed hard. This was the moment. The moment where I had to decide whether to tell him the truth, that I was from the future, that we'd both died, that his so-called love for Serena was just a cover for his obsession with destroying Graham, or to make up something that was just convincing enough to keep him from killing me. I chose option 3. "I've been doing some research," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "About Graham. I know he's been working on a secret project, an acquisition fund that's been quietly buying up shares in rival companies. If you'd bought that necklace, he would have used it against you. He would have made you look impulsive, unstable, and he would have told everyone you're not fit to lead." Julian's eyes narrowed. "How do you know this?" "I have sources. Contacts I've been cultivating for months. I didn't want to tell you before because I didn't have proof, but tonight I couldn't stay quiet anymore. If he wins this, he wins everything. And we can't let that happen." It was a lie. Every word of it. But it was the kind of lie that was just plausible enough to make him pause. He studied me for a long moment. And then, to my surprise, he laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was cold, sharp, the laugh of a predator who has just realized his prey is more interesting than he thought. "Sources," he repeated. "Contacts. A research project you never mentioned." He stepped back, circling me like a shark. "And here I thought you were just a pretty face who could type." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. "You know what I think?" he said, stopping in front of me again. "I think you're lying. I think you have some other reason for stopping me tonight. And I think you're going to tell me what it is." "I told you." "Don't lie to me." His voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. "I've been lied to by better liars than you. You're going to tell me the truth, or you're going to find yourself looking for a new job. A very, very dangerous new job." I met his eyes. And I made a decision. "Okay," I said. "I'll tell you." I spent the next hour explaining the future, my future, our future, the future where we both drowned because he couldn't let go of his obsession with Graham. I told him about the necklace, the auction, the way he'd been manipulated into wasting his money and his reputation. I told him about the acquisition fund, about the way Graham had played him for a fool, about the way we'd both ended up dead. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, the silence between us was heavier than I'd ever felt. "So," he said finally, "you're telling me you're from the future?" "Yes." "And you're telling me that in this future, we both die?" "Yes." "And you're telling me that you came back to save us?" "Yes." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "I think you're completely insane." I opened my mouth to argue, but he held up a hand. "I also think you believe what you're saying." He shook his head slowly. "And I think that's more interesting than anything you could have said." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let you prove it." He walked to his desk and sat down, picking up a pen and tapping it against the wood. "You say you have sources. You say you know things. Fine. Prove it. If you can deliver on your promise, if you can find me a deal that makes up for the 30 million I didn't spend tonight, I'll believe you. And if I can't?" Then you'll be the most well-funded former assistant in history. He smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Because I'll give you a severance package that will let you disappear forever. I nodded. Deal. The next day, I woke up at dawn and started planning. I knew exactly where to go. There was a market in the oldest part of the city, a chaotic, overcrowded maze of stalls and vendors where you could buy anything from a vintage Rolex to a painting that turned out to be worth millions. In my previous life, Graham had discovered a masterpiece there, a long-lost Renaissance work that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. He'd bought it for a few $100s and sold it for a fortune. I was going to beat him to it. I called Julian and told him to dress casually. He showed up in a $3,000 cashmere coat, looking like a billionaire slumming it for sport. I didn't bother to comment. The market was chaos. Stalls selling everything from antique furniture to counterfeit handbags to mysterious boxes whose contents no one could identify. We pushed through the crowd, past vendors shouting and customers haggling, until I found the stall I was looking for. It was tucked in the corner, almost invisible, run by an old man who looked like he'd been sitting there for decades. He was sleeping on his stool, his hat pulled down over his eyes. I walked past the piles of junk, old keys, cracked pottery, a stack of yellowed newspapers, and stopped in front of a painting that was propped against the back of the stall. It was a mess. The canvas was cracked, the edges torn, the colors faded almost to gray. But even through the dirt, I could see the outline of a face, the curve of a shoulder, the hint of a landscape behind it. There, I said. That one. Julian looked at it. He looked at me. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. I called out to the old man, who woke with a start. Excuse me, sir. How much for this painting? He squinted at it. At us. At the painting again. $50. I pulled out my wallet. $50 was not a lot of money. $50 was the price of a nice dinner. $50 was the price of, potentially, changing everything. Julian grabbed my arm before I could hand over the cash. What are you doing? He hissed. That thing is garbage. Trust me, I said. He didn't let go. $50, I said again, louder this time. $50 and you have a deal. The old man shrugged. $50 and it's yours. I freed my arm from Julian's grip and handed over the cash. The old man took it, pocketed it, and closed his eyes again. I picked up the painting, holding it carefully by its edges, and turned to face my boss. This, I said, is the future. He looked at the painting. Then at me. I hope, he said dryly, you know what you're doing. I didn't. Not really. But I was about to find out. We didn't go straight to the auction house. Julian insisted on having the painting looked at by someone he trusted, a quiet, nervous man named Dr. Chen, who ran a small restoration studio on the outskirts of the city. Dr. Chen had been in the business for 40 years, and while he didn't have the flashy reputation of the big-name auction house experts, he had something more important: discretion. He also owed Julian a favor. Julian had helped him out of a legal mess a few years back, and Dr. Chen had never forgotten it. When we walked into his studio, he was hunched over a workbench, a magnifying glass strapped to his head. He looked up, blinked at us, and then at the painting I was holding. What have you brought me? His voice was soft, almost a whisper. A painting, I said. I can see that. He took it from me with the reverence of a man handling something precious, even if he wasn't sure what it was yet. Where did you find it? A flea market. $50. He glanced at me, eyebrow raised, but didn't comment. He carried the painting to a light table and set it down carefully, turning on a bright lamp that illuminated every crack and smudge. For a long time, he was silent. Julian paced behind me, his impatience growing with each passing second. I could feel his eyes on my back, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. I stayed still, watching Dr. Chen work. The old man's hands were gentle as they traced the edges of the canvas, brushing away decades of dust. He reached for a microscope and leaned in close, his breath held in concentration. Then he sat up so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. Oh my, he said. Oh my what? Julian demanded, stepping forward. Dr. Chen turned to us, his face pale. Where did you say you found this? A flea market. $50. Yes. Dr. Chen looked at the painting again. Then at me. Then at the painting again. This, he said slowly, is a Rembrandt. I couldn't hide my smile. I'd known it was valuable, but I hadn't known exactly how valuable. The details hadn't been part of my memory, just the fact that it was worth a fortune. But hearing the word Rembrandt come out of Dr. Chen's mouth made it real. Julian's expression went through a series of transformations. Disbelief, shock, and then a slow, dangerous grin. You're telling me, he said, that this $50 garbage is a Rembrandt? It is, Dr. Chen said, his voice trembling. I can't be completely certain without a full authentication, but the brushwork, the pigments, the style, this is unmistakable. It's a Rembrandt. An unknown Rembrandt. This could change everything. How much? Julian asked. Dr. Chen hesitated. In its current condition. With a full authentication, a proper restoration, and the right marketing. I'd estimate it at 50 million. Maybe more. The room went silent. I watched Julian's face shift, his dark eyes narrowing in calculation, his jaw tightening with barely contained excitement. $50 million. $50 million from a $50 investment. That was the kind of return that made people famous. That made people legends. And I had given it to him. He turned to me, and his expression was strange, a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and something that looked almost like respect. How? He asked. How did you know? I opened my mouth, ready to deliver another carefully crafted lie about research and contacts. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the moment, or maybe I was just tired of pretending. I looked him straight in the eye and said, because I've already lived this life once. And I'm not going to let you make the same mistakes again. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, you really believe that, don't you? That you've come back from the dead? I don't just believe it, I said. I know it. I thought he would laugh. I thought he would dismiss me as crazy and move on. But he didn't. He just kept watching me with that unreadable expression, weighing my words, trying to decide if I was useful or insane. Or maybe both. Fine, he said finally. You've earned your chance. Take the painting to the auction house. Start the authentication process. If it's real, you've proven yourself. If it's not. He let the threat hang in the air. It's real, I said. We'll see. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and mounting excitement. Dr. Chen referred us to a specialist at Sotheby's who confirmed his initial assessment. The painting was old. It was authentic. It was, as much as anyone could tell at this stage, a genuine Rembrandt. The authentication process would take weeks, but the experts were cautiously optimistic. Julian, for his part, was more focused on the impact than the process. The board wants to meet, he told me one morning, tossing a file onto my desk. They've heard rumors about the painting, and they want to know what's going on. I need you there. Me. Why? Because you're the one who found it. And because I want to see the look on their faces when I tell them that my assistant made the deal of the century. I didn't argue. I never argued with Julian when he was in this kind of mood, the kind of mood where he was thinking about winning, about proving himself, about making everyone who'd ever doubted him eat their words. The board meeting was held in the conference room on the top floor of the company building. The room was all glass and steel, designed to intimidate. I'd been in it before, but never like this, never as the center of attention. Julian sat at the head of the table, looking every inch the powerful CEO. I stood behind him, slightly to the right, where I could see everyone's faces. Thank you all for coming, Julian began. I know you've been hearing rumors about a recent acquisition. I'm here to confirm them. He nodded at me, and I stepped forward. The room was silent. All eyes were on me, the board members, the executives, the men and women who had built this company and had spent the past few months wondering if Julian was losing his mind. I took a deep breath. Last week, I made a purchase. A painting, bought at a flea market for $50. Preliminary authentication suggests that the painting is a previously unknown Rembrandt. If confirmed, its value could exceed $50 million. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then someone laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, followed by a voice that I recognized immediately. Mr. Foster, the oldest and most influential board member, was leaning back in his chair, a smug smile on his face. $50, he repeated. You expect us to believe that your assistant found a Rembrandt at a flea market for $50? That's not just unlikely. That's impossible. I knew he'd say that. It was exactly what Graham's faction on the board would say. And I'd prepared for it. I'm not asking you to believe, I said. I'm asking you to wait for the authentication results, which will be ready by the end of the month. In the meantime, I've already arranged for the painting to be featured in a preliminary exhibition at Sotheby's, just enough to start building interest. Mr. Foster's smile faded. You've already spoken to Sotheby's. Of course. We need to create buzz before the auction. The more interest we generate, the higher the final price. I turned to Julian, who was watching me with that same unreadable expression. Would you like me to share the marketing plan? Julian nodded slowly. Please. I spent the next hour detailing our plans. The press releases, the exclusive previews, the carefully crafted story of the painting's discovery. By the time I finished, Mr. Foster's smugness had turned to grudging interest. It's a good plan, he admitted. It's a great plan, Julian corrected. Thanks to my assistant. I managed not to smirk. Graham wasn't going to give up that easily. The following weekend, I was at the office, going over the final details of the Sotheby's exhibition, when a courier arrived with an envelope. The return address was listed as the Veritas Group, Graham's holding company. Inside was an invitation. Mr. Graham Cordova requests the pleasure of your company at a private gathering celebrating the launch of his new philanthropic initiative. Please join us at the Cordova estate on Saturday evening at 8 o'clock. I turned the invitation over in my hands. This wasn't a friendly gesture. This was a message. Graham was telling me he knew what I was doing, and that he was coming for me. I called Julian that night. Did you get one too? I asked. I got 3, he said, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. He's trying to rattle us. Is it working? Not even a little bit. But I need you there. If he's going to make a move, I want to see it coming. I groaned. Can't you take someone else? Someone who won't stick out like a sore thumb. That's exactly why I need you. You're the one who found the painting. You're the one who's been running the operation. He's going to be interested in you, and I want to see what he does about it. That sounds like a terrible plan. It's a perfect plan. Just be yourself. Which version of myself? The one who doesn't let anyone push her around. I sighed. Fine. But if he tries to kill me, you're the one who's going to explain it to HR. The party was exactly as I expected, an exercise in ostentatious wealth, with champagne, caviar, and polite conversation. Graham greeted us at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was tall, good-looking, and impeccably dressed, the kind of man who seemed to have everything and wanted everyone to know it. Julian, he said, extending a hand. So good of you to come. Julian shook it, his expression equally pleasant. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. You know I love seeing what you're up to. Serena appeared at Graham's side, looking elegant in a floor-length gown that probably cost more than my yearly salary. Thank you for coming, she said, and there was a hint of warning in her voice. We're so glad you could make it. I watched them interact, and I realized something. This wasn't just a party. This was a performance. Graham was showing off his empire. Serena was playing the perfect hostess. And Julian was the audience they wanted to impress. Too bad they didn't know that I was the one writing the script. The party was a masterclass in passive aggression. Graham led us through the crowd like a general surveying his troops, pointing out the various accomplishments of the people in attendance. A senator here, a tech billionaire there, a famous actress who was probably dating someone she shouldn't be. It was all very impressive. It was also all very calculated. I see you've been keeping busy, Graham said, his eyes flicking to me. I heard about your little discovery. A Rembrandt. At a flea market. That's quite the story. It's a good story, I said. The best ones usually are. He laughed, a warm, easy laugh that didn't reach his eyes. I like you. You've got spirit. It's a shame you're working for him. He jerked his head toward Julian, who was a few steps away, talking to someone from the financial press. You could do so much better. I'm happy where I am. Are you? Or are you just afraid to try something new? I met his gaze steadily. I'm not afraid of anything, Mr. Cordova. Graham, he corrected, and his smile widened. We're all friends here. Serena appeared at his side, her hand on his arm. She was beautiful, in the way that people who've never had to struggle are beautiful. Everything about her was effortless. Her hair, her dress, her smile. It was the kind of beauty that made other people feel like they were missing something. Graham, darling, you're monopolizing our guests, she said, her voice sweet as honey. Let them mingle. I was just getting to know Julian's assistant. He looked at me again, and this time his eyes were colder. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk later. I watched them walk away, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He knew. Somehow, he knew what I was doing, and he was already planning his countermove. Julian appeared at my side. What did he want? To threaten me, I think. Or recruit me. I'm not sure which. Both, probably. He looked toward Graham, and his expression was unreadable. He's not going to give up easily. Neither am I. He glanced at me, and something in his gaze softened. I know. The authentication results came back a week later. I was in my office when Julian walked in, a thick folder in his hand. He didn't say anything. He just set it on my desk and waited. I opened the folder. The first page was a letter from Sotheby's, confirming that the painting was indeed a genuine Rembrandt. The second page was a preliminary valuation, $45 to $50 million, with the possibility of more after restoration. I looked up at Julian. Congratulations, I said. This is your win, he said. You found it. You made it happen. I just pointed at it. You saved my life. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that I hadn't heard before. You stopped me from making a mistake that would have cost everything. You found a way to beat Graham at his own game. And you did it without asking for anything in return. I'm asking for a raise now, I said. If that's okay. He laughed, a real laugh this time, warm and unguarded. You can have whatever you want. Anything. He paused. Within reason. I smiled. I'll keep that in mind. Graham's response came 2 days later. I was in the middle of a meeting when my phone buzzed with a breaking news alert. I glanced at the screen and felt my blood run cold. Sotheby's official claims Rembrandt discovery was a hoax. Experts raise questions about authenticity. I clicked on the link. The article was detailed and damning. It quoted experts who claimed the painting had been tampered with. It mentioned Graham's foundation as a neutral party that had been concerned about the integrity of the art market. And it ended with a question. If the painting was fake, who was responsible? I knew exactly who was responsible. I called Julian immediately. I saw it, he said before I could speak. He's trying to destroy the painting's credibility. What do? We fight back. We have the authentication report, the original documentation, the chain of custody. We release everything. We prove that the painting is real, and we make him look like a liar in the process. That might not be enough. He's already planted the seeds of doubt. Then we plant better ones. I spent the next 24 hours working non-stop, preparing a response. We issued a statement with the full authentication report, timelines, and photos of the painting before restoration. We pointed out the flaws in the experts' methodology. We went on the offensive. It worked. Mostly. The questions about the painting's authenticity died down, but the damage was already done. The story was out there, and it would follow the painting forever. Graham had won the first round. But the fight wasn't over yet. Serena reached out to me a few days later. I was in my office, working on the new marketing campaign, when I got a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I typed back, "About what?" "About Graham. About Julian. About what's coming next." I didn't trust Serena. I never had. But I also knew that she was the closest thing to an inside source I was going to get. If she was offering information, I would take it. "Where?" I wrote. "The cafe on 12th Street. Tomorrow at noon." I showed Julian the messages. "She's trying to manipulate you," he said. "Probably. But she might also be telling the truth. Or she could be leading you into a trap. I can handle myself." He studied my face for a moment, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He didn't want me to go. He didn't want me to take the risk. But he also knew that if I didn't go, we might never get another chance to understand what Graham was planning. "Fine," he said. "But I'm sending a car. And I'm putting a tracker on your phone." "You already put a tracker on my phone." "I know. I'm putting another one." I met Serena at the cafe the next day. She looked different outside the party circuit. More human, less polished. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of a designer dress. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know this isn't easy. I'm not sure what you want to tell me. I want to warn you." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Graham is planning something big. Something that's going to destroy Julian. And you're caught in the middle." "What are you talking about?" "The Rembrandt, that wasn't just a random attack. He's been planning this for months. He's got people inside Julian's company, people who are feeding him information. He knows about the acquisition fund, the auction, everything. And he's going to use it all against you." "Then why are you telling me?" She hesitated. "Because I don't want to be part of it anymore. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be loved, and I thought that meant being with someone powerful. But I've seen what Graham is capable of. And I don't want to be there when he finally destroys himself." I studied her for a moment. She looked sincere. But I'd been deceived before. "If you're telling the truth," I said, "then help me. Help me stop him." "I can't." She shook her head. "He's too powerful. He's got too many resources. But I can tell you one thing, he's planning to expose something about Julian, something that will ruin his reputation for good. I don't know what it is, but I know he's been working on it for weeks." I thought about Julian's past, the things I knew about him, the things I didn't. He had secrets, just like everyone else. But none of them were big enough to destroy him. None of them were big enough to bring down an empire. Or were they? "Thanks," I said, standing. "I appreciate the warning. Be careful, Avery." She reached out, her hand brushing my arm. "He's not just going to destroy Julian. He's going to destroy everyone who stands with him." I nodded and walked out of the cafe. I didn't tell Julian about the warning. Not yet. I needed to find out more first. The attack came 3 days later. It was subtle at first, a whisper in the press, a rumor in the financial community. Someone had been digging into Julian's past, uncovering evidence of a deal gone wrong years ago, a lawsuit that had been settled quietly, a secret that had been buried deeper than anyone thought possible. I watched the coverage grow, watched the story spread, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Graham was finally making his move. And I was determined to stop him. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of my morning coffee when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline was short, brutal, and devastating: Julian Vance, the secret deal that cost hundreds their savings. I dropped my mug. It shattered on the floor, coffee spreading across the tiles like blood, but I didn't care. I was already scrolling through the article, my heart pounding in my chest. The story was detailed and damning. It went back 15 years, to a deal Julian had been involved in early in his career. A real estate development that had gone wrong. Investors who had lost everything. A lawsuit that had been settled quietly, with a non-disclosure agreement that had kept the whole thing buried for over a decade. Except now it wasn't buried anymore. Graham had found it. Graham had dug it up, polished it, and presented it to the world like a gift. And it was going to destroy everything Julian had built. I called him immediately. He didn't answer. I called again. And again. Nothing. I grabbed my keys and drove to his penthouse. He was sitting in the dark when I arrived. The curtains were drawn, the lights off, the only illumination coming from the city glow filtering through the windows. He was in an armchair, still in his suit from the day before, a half-empty glass of whiskey on the table beside him. I didn't say anything. I just walked over and sat down across from him. "How bad is it?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "Bad. The board is calling for my resignation. The press is camped outside. My phone hasn't stopped ringing." "Is it true?" I knew it was a risky question, but I needed to hear the answer. Did it happen the way they're saying? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "It happened, but not the way they're telling it." I leaned forward. "Tell me." 15 years ago, I was young, ambitious, stupid. I got involved in a deal that I thought was going to make me a fortune. I didn't do enough due diligence. I trusted the wrong people. And when it fell apart, I was the only one left holding the bag. He paused, taking a long drink from the glass. I didn't know the investors were going to lose everything. I didn't know the developer was a fraud. I made mistakes, but I didn't set out to hurt anyone. I tried to make it right. I settled with everyone who came forward. I paid back as much as I could. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was ashamed. And because I didn't think it mattered anymore." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with something I'd never seen before, fear. I thought I had buried it. But Graham was patient. He waited until the moment was right, and then he pulled the trigger. "So what do we do?" "There's nothing we can do." He set down the glass, his hand steady. "I'm going to resign. I'm going to issue a statement, accept responsibility, and step down. It's the only way to protect the company." "And what about Graham?" "Graham wins. That's how it works. The villain gets the victory, and the hero walks away broken." I stood up. "No." He blinked. "What?" "No. You're not resigning. You're not giving him what he wants." "I don't have a choice." "You always have a choice." I walked over to him, grabbing his shoulders and forcing him to look at me. "You made a mistake 15 years ago. You were young. You were stupid. But you fixed it. You settled the lawsuits. You paid back the money. You did everything you could to make it right. And Graham is trying to use that against you. People won't care about that. Then we'll make them care." I reached for my phone, scrolling through the article. The story doesn't mention that you settled. It doesn't mention that you paid back the investors. It doesn't mention the years you spent trying to make it right. But I can find those details. I can find the people who were involved, the ones who got their money back. I can turn this into a story about redemption." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, "that you can spin a scandal into a narrative?" "I'm telling you that I can do whatever it takes." I paused. "But I need your help. I need to know everything. Every detail. Every name. Every single thing Graham might use against you." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not just my assistant, are you?" "I'm your partner," I said. "And partners don't let each other fail." The next few days were a blur of research, calls, and careful planning. I found the investors. Most of them, anyway. I found the settlement records. I found the people who had forgiven Julian years ago, who had moved on with their lives and had no desire to see him destroyed. I called them, wrote to them, convinced them to come forward. It wasn't easy. Most of them wanted nothing to do with the press. But I was persistent, and I was persuasive. I'm not asking you to defend him, I told one woman, a retired teacher who'd lost her retirement savings. I'm asking you to tell the truth. Tell them that you got your money back. Tell them that you forgave him. Tell them that you don't want him destroyed over a mistake he made when he was 22. She was quiet for a long moment. He was a kid, she said finally. A kid who got in over his head. And he made it right. I don't have anything against him. Then tell them that. She agreed. One by one, they agreed. The day of the press conference, I stood behind Julian, watching the room fill with reporters. He looked calm, composed, the picture of a man who had accepted his fate. But I could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands. He was terrified. And I was about to make him face the fear head-on. Are you ready? I asked. No, he said. But I'm doing it anyway. He stepped up to the microphone, and the room fell silent. Thank you all for coming, he said. I know there have been a lot of questions about my past, and I'm here to answer them. He told them everything. The mistake, the shame, the years he'd spent trying to make it right. He didn't try to excuse what he'd done, he simply told the truth. And then I stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. These are statements from the people who were involved, I said. People who lost money, and people who got it back. They're here today because they want you to know the full story. I opened the folder and began to read. The reporters listened. The cameras recorded. And when I finished, the silence that followed was filled with something new. Not anger, but uncertainty. Thank you, Julian said. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my side of the story. He stepped away from the podium, and I felt a surge of relief. We'd done it. We'd turned the narrative around. But I knew the battle wasn't over. Graham's response came that evening. I was in my office when the call came through, a number I didn't recognize. I answered it anyway. Ms. Avery, Graham's voice said, smooth and confident. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd be able to spin it so well. I didn't spin anything, I said. I just told the truth. The truth. He laughed softly. You really are something, you know that? If you were working for me, you'd be a millionaire by now. I'm doing fine where I am. For now. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was harder. But I want you to understand something. This isn't over. I know about your little project. I know you're building a fund to compete with mine. And I won't let that happen. You don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Avery. I'm just hoping you make the right one. He hung up. I stared at the phone for a long moment, my heart pounding. He knew about the fund. He knew what I was planning. And he was going to try to stop me. I wasn't going to let him. The night of the auction arrived like a storm. The city was alive with anticipation, the streets buzzing with limousines and flashing cameras. Sotheby's had transformed its main hall into something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and a stage that seemed to float above the crowd like a cloud of gold. And at the center of it all was the painting. The Rembrandt. Our Rembrandt. I stood in the wings, watching the guests arrive. The wealthiest collectors in the world, the most powerful investors, the people who had the power to make or break careers with a single bid. They were here to see a miracle, to witness the moment a $50 flea market find became a $50 million masterpiece. But I knew it wasn't just the painting they were here to see. They were here to see Julian and Graham face off one last time. Julian found me in the wings, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the tension underneath. Are you ready for this? I asked. I've been ready my whole life. I smiled. That's the spirit. The auction started with other pieces, the warm-up acts designed to build excitement. A Monet here, a Van Gogh there, nothing that could compete with the main event. Then the auctioneer stepped forward, his voice ringing through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment we've all been waiting for. Lot 47, an unknown work by Rembrandt van Rijn, discovered in a flea market and authenticated by the world's leading experts. The starting bid is $10 million. The room buzzed. 10 million. 15 million. 20 million. I watched the numbers climb, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the moment we'd been working toward. This was the moment that would define everything. But I knew Graham wasn't going to let it happen without a fight. He was sitting in the front row, flanked by his usual entourage. Serena sat beside him, her face pale and pinched. She was trying to look calm, but I could see the tension in her posture. 30 million. The bid came from Graham's corner. I wasn't surprised. He was trying to drive up the price, to make us look like fools if we didn't win. But we were going to win. I'd made sure of it. 35 million. The bid came from Julian. His voice was steady, confident. He looked like he was enjoying himself. 40 million. Graham again. I leaned over to Julian, whispering, "He's trying to trap you. Don't let him." Julian's expression didn't change. "I know." 50 million. The room gasped. That was the highest bid of the night. The auctioneer looked at Graham, then at Julian. "Do I hear 55? Before Julian could respond, I stepped forward. Every eye in the room turned to me. I raised my hand and said, 60 million. The room erupted. Whispers, shouts, gasps. I could feel the weight of their stares, the intensity of their curiosity. They had no idea who I was or why I was bidding. But they knew something was happening. Graham's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Who is that?" I heard someone ask. "That's Julian's assistant," another voice answered. "The one who found the painting." 60 million. Going once. Graham raised his hand, his face tight. 70 million. I felt my heart race. This was exactly what I'd hoped for. He was raising the price because he thought he could. He thought he was going to win. But I was about to prove him wrong. 80 million. The room went quiet. The auctioneer looked at me, his eyes wide. 80 million going once. I waited. Going twice. Graham was staring at me, his expression unreadable. Sold. The hammer fell. The room exploded into applause. But it wasn't just any applause. It was the applause of people who'd just watched something they'd never forget. People who'd just seen a nobody outbid a billionaire. And when Graham stood to leave, I made sure to catch his eye and smile. Later that night, Julian found me on the rooftop of the building, looking out over the city. "You were brilliant," he said, his voice soft. "I was lucky." "I don't think it was luck." He walked over, stopping beside me. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "The painting was always going to be valuable," I said. "I just made sure Graham had to pay for the privilege of losing it." He laughed. "And now he's 40 million poorer and looking like a fool." "Don't forget the press coverage," I added. "The headlines tomorrow are going to be merciless." "I can't wait." He turned to me, and there was something different in his eyes. Something softer, more vulnerable. "I couldn't have done this without you, Avery. I know I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful." "You say it plenty." "I don't say it enough." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I'm going to do something now that might be inappropriate." Before I could ask what, he leaned in and kissed me. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, he deepened it, his hand cupping the back of my head as if he was afraid I might disappear. When we broke apart, I was breathless. "What was that?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, smiling. "But I'd like to do it again." The aftermath of the auction was everything I'd hoped it would be. The headlines were merciless toward Graham. He looked like a fool, a sore loser who couldn't accept defeat. His stock dropped. His investors lost faith. His carefully constructed empire started to crack. Serena left him. I heard about it from a mutual acquaintance. She'd packed her bags and walked out, finally tired of being a trophy in a game she'd never chosen to play. Graham tried to salvage what he could, but it was too late. The Rembrandt went to a private collector in Europe, its final price a testament to Julian's triumph. The fund I'd been building took off, attracting investors from across the world. And Julian and we finally let ourselves admit what was happening. It wasn't easy. We were both damaged in our own ways, both carrying scars from past lives. But we were also both survivors, both determined to build something better. And together, we did. Julian and I started a new company together. One that focused on what we did best, finding treasure where no one else thought to look. We called it the Treasure Hunt Fund, and it became the most successful investment vehicle of its kind. We never talked about the fact that I was from the future. Maybe because we didn't need to. Maybe because the present was enough. On the day we launched our first major fund, Julian stood in front of the press and said, "This is all because of one person." He looked at me, a smile playing on his lips. Someone who taught me that the best things in life are the ones you don't see coming. I blushed, and the cameras flashed. It was the beginning of something new. And this time, we were both going to live. Epilogue: The man who lost everything. Graham Cordova walked out of the prison gates on a Tuesday. The sky was grey, the air cold, and the world that greeted him was nothing like the one he'd left behind. 2 years had passed. 2 years of silence, of routine, of staring at the same 4 walls and replaying every mistake he'd ever made. He had expected someone to meet him. A lawyer, perhaps. An assistant. One of the sycophantic hangers-on who had once filled his office and laughed at his jokes. But the parking lot was empty, the road quiet, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic on the highway. He took a breath and started walking. The city had changed. Not in the ways that mattered. The buildings were the same, the streets the same, the rhythm of life the same, but in the ways that cut the deepest. His old office was gone, replaced by a coffee shop. His penthouse had been sold, the new owners gutting it and rebuilding it into something that looked nothing like the home he'd once known. He found a cheap hotel, the kind where the wallpaper was peeling and the sheets smelled of bleach. He paid for a week with the last of his cash and sat on the bed, staring at the blank television screen. He had nothing. No money, no power, no empire. Everything he'd spent his life building had crumbled in the space of a single year. And it was all because of one person. He found Julian first. It was at a charity gala, the kind of event he used to attend as a guest of honor. Now he was watching from the street, peering through the windows like a ghost, his reflection a pale spectre against the glass. Julian was at the center of the room, surrounded by admirers, his arm around the woman who had ruined him. Avery. The assistant. The woman who had seen through his plans and outmaneuvered him at every turn. She was wearing a gown that cost more than Graham had in his entire bank account. She was smiling, laughing, the center of attention. And Julian was looking at her like she was the only person in the world. Graham felt something twist in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't jealousy. It was something worse, a cold, empty recognition that he had been replaced. That he had never really mattered. He turned away and walked back into the night. He found Serena next. It was an accident, really. He was walking through a park, aimless, directionless, when he saw her sitting on a bench with a toddler in her lap. She was laughing, her face bright with an ease he'd never seen in her before. She looked up, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she handed the child to the woman beside her, a woman he didn't recognize, and walked over to him. "Graham," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, with none of the fear or resentment he'd expected. "Serena." He didn't know what else to say. "I heard you were out." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "How are you doing?" "Fine." He laughed, a hollow sound. "I'm fine. I'm doing great." She studied him for a moment, and he could see the pity in her eyes. He hated it. He hated that she could look at him like that, like he was something broken and sad. "I'm sorry," she said. "For everything. I know I should have done more." "You should have stayed," he said. "You should have been there." "I couldn't." She shook her head. "I couldn't be part of it anymore. The lies, the manipulation, the way you treated everyone like pawns. I couldn't be that person." "You weren't that person. You were just." He trailed off. She waited. I loved you, he said finally. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know. But that doesn't mean I had to stay. He didn't try to see Julian again. Instead, he found a job, a small one, nothing like the empire he used to run. He worked in a warehouse, stacking boxes, moving inventory, doing the kind of work he'd never imagined he'd have to do. It was humiliating. It was exhausting. It was the first honest work he'd ever done. He thought about the past sometimes. The deals, the parties, the victories. He thought about the people he'd hurt and the ones who'd hurt him. He thought about Julian and Avery and the future he'd tried to steal. And he thought about what it would take to get it all back. But he never tried. Because he knew, deep down, that the game was over. He'd lost. And there was no coming back from that. One night, he found himself standing outside the office where it had all begun. It was the building Julian had bought after the trial, the headquarters of the Treasure Hunt Fund. The lights were on, the windows bright, and through the glass, he could see people working, laughing, building something new. He stood there for a long time, watching. And then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw Avery at the window. She was looking out at the street, her face lit by the glow of the city. She saw him, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she raised her hand. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness. It was a simple acknowledgement, a recognition that they had both been part of something, and that it was over now. Graham nodded, then turned and walked away. He never looked back. Years later, Graham Cordova became a minor footnote in the history of the city. A cautionary tale, a lesson about the dangers of pride and ambition. But he was alive. He was free. And for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to prove. It wasn't victory. It wasn't happiness. But it was something. And sometimes, that was enough.